This is part 2 of Autism and Medical Cannabis. I'm Dr. Alan Flashman, and the first section we discussed the plant cannabis, and we tried to understand the way that plants and human biology interact. Today we're going to make a short discussion of autism so we can understand what it is we would like to influence when we use a plant like medical cannabis. And so what I want to talk about today is how we think about the treatment goals when we treat autism. How would we define those goals? Now, first of all, we have to understand that the term autism is very, very inexact. And it really is a little bit anachronistic as well. It comes from ways of thinking that we don't really adopt anymore. But if we use the term to describe a range of children and adults with a different, it's now called neurodiverse, a different function of the nervous system, calling it autism is an aspect of over-function, over-focus, that you're focusing on just that part of it that seems not to be related and not on the other parts of it. And over-focus is not our friend, as we saw when we talked about the plant. Over-focusing on one molecule leads to oversimplification of very complex systems and to results that are less than accurate. So if we talk about this range of people who are probably quite different from each other, genetically and otherwise, so we would want to talk about something about the brain that is worth understanding that is relatively new. Now, from biology, we talked last time about molecules, but when you're dealing in biology, the basic center of focus is what's called a cell. And once upon a time, when we thought about the brain, we would try to think about what cell is doing what. And then we talked about centers, which were groups of cells. And we said, well, what groups of cells are doing what? That's old science. In the last 10 or 20 years, we've been able to use the fMRI, that's the way of looking at movement in the brain, and now we think more about how things are connected. There are some centers, but the centers communicate with each other, and that's called connectivity. And that's more like energy. It's a pattern of how things are. And there are really two basic patterns that we think of now. This will undoubtedly change over time as we get more sophisticated. But just for example, the two main forms of organization of the brain, and that means the connectivity, the pattern in which the centers are centers of cells, the way that they communicate one with the other, there are two different patterns. One of which is called the resting state, which, think about it as sort of like meditation, functions that are more inside of yourself. And the other is the executive state. Think about it like fixing a motorcycle, with all due respect to the Zen of motorcycle repair. Motorcycle repair and the resting state actually are different brain functions, and the different ways in which the brain is organized. So that's interesting, but what's even more interesting is that you go back and forth between one form of connectivity and the other. So there's connectivity of connectivity. There are these two states, and there's a way in which they go back and forth. And you can imagine that if they don't go back and forth smoothly, you're going to have trouble. For example, you're going to have frustration attacks, which unfortunately are called rage attacks, but they're frustration. And there is one paper, and I think there'll be more, that suggests that in many children or adults with autism, the movement between being inside and being outside, it doesn't work smoothly. It grumbles along and sometimes creates these frustrations. And sometimes it creates, if you can imagine, attention, difficulty in attention, because to have attention, you have to, what you're doing now is you're listening to this video, you're going inside yourself, you're going outside yourself. It's smooth. If you can't do that smoothly, it's going to look like a problem with attention. So you see, there's two ways to look at what we want to treat in autism. Now, to treat always in medicine should mean reducing suffering. That's what medicine is about, reducing suffering. And so if we say, well, what kind of suffering do we want to reduce? One way to look at it is to talk about the reduction of symptoms. And to do that, you sort of partialize everything. Remember the overfocus and say, well, bang, 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 we're shooting at different things. For example, there were these so-called rage attacks, which are really frustration. What limits, what lowers rage attacks? And then language. So let's see what, connects to language. So far, nothing. Communication. What connects to communication? Attention? Oh, well, we have ways of treating attention, as it were. So let's treat the attention. Sleep. There's lots of ways to treat sleep. So you're going to start treating sleep, and you get attention, and you get the rage. So we're going to have, obviously, polypharmacy, shooting for different symptoms. The other way to think about it, and that's the one that I'm trying to encourage here, is that we think about overall brain function. In other words, we say, and that's what we would ask of something complex like cannabis. We would ask, does the cannabis improve overall brain function so that there's less frustration and more language and better communication and better attention and better sleep? That's what we would ask from a plant like cannabis. Do we always get all of it? We'll talk about that in the third video. But that's what we'd be asking, rather than saying, does cannabis shoot at this symptom or that symptom? And so you see that the current approach, short of cannabis, which I find to be very frustrating. I don't get frustration attacks from it, but it makes me pretty frustrated, is that you say, well, that's rage. What diminishes rage? So there are medications that downregulate dopamine. They block the dopamine at the dopamine receptors. And that supposedly is, I don't know what, that's a pretty global way to do things. It's very, very inexact, but that's what drugs like risperidol and Zyprexa and the other so-called major tranquilizers or anti-anxiety, major tranquilizers or antipsychotic medications, that's supposedly what they do. And so a lot of children with autism, if they're having these frustration attacks, which are called rage attacks, they're given an antipsychotic agent. It's an import. It's not really has anything to do with autism. It's an import from the locked wards of psychiatry, but that's what you do when you ain't got nothing. So it's imported. The results are very bad. So now and then there are children that improve with it. A lot of children have a great deal of trouble with the side effects from it, and it doesn't really last very long in the effect. So it's a very limited treatment, but the idea of medication is, again, it's overfocus. You're not treating autism. You certainly have no idea what on earth risperidol is doing to connectivity and the connectivity of connectivity. You're shooting low. You're shooting at receptors, which, as I explained in the first video, is an oversimplification. And the same is true of using a stimulant like Ritalin, or all the things that are like Ritalin, to treat attention. Is every child with autism also to be diagnosed as attention deficit? As you know, there's a huge debate about whether attention deficit is a valid, stable kind of a diagnosis. If it is, it's pretty different than every other diagnosis we know, because we don't know how it works and we can't specify it, and the overlap in symptoms is pretty, it's a nightmare of a diagnosis. But let's say that some kids improve with Ritalin, but kids with autism, autistic kids, an awful lot of them have trouble with attention. Is that because they suffer from another problem? You see, they have rage, that's a problem, and they have attention deficit, that's another problem. That's pretty that's pretty problematic medical thinking. And it would be easier to think that the difficulty with connectivity, going back and forth from in and out, creates a difficulty in attention in an awful lot of kids with autism. And autistic kids need help with connectivity, not with something that overdiagnoses them with something else. I have to say that in my experience, the use of all of these stimulants in order to get autistic kids to be better focused, the results are bad. Here and there you'll find a kid that it helps, and that's wonderful. We may not know why, or maybe that particular kid has attention deficit, whatever that is. But overall, for the population, the results are not good. It doesn't really get you the attention that you want, and you get a bunch of side effects, and in the end, not a lot of autistic kids stay on Ritalin. It doesn't really help them in the way that it's supposed to. So if we say, well, if we don't want to overfocus, which is the way medications do, then we want to ask of medical cannabis something that is more general, something that has to do with improving brain function. And if you recall, I said we're pretty much in the dark with cannabis. There's hundreds of molecules we don't understand. Well, in brain science, we're really in the dark because no one ever thought about this sort of connectivity until you could measure it. And now that we're measuring that, we'll be measuring other things. And so we're just starting to shine a flashlight into a universe of darkness about brain function. And as that connects, that's, I think, where we want to go with autism. That's, I think, where we want to try to figure out what is the way that the brain is not functioning in a smooth way, and how can we help that globally, and then look at which symptoms improve as we improve overall brain function.